Good afternoon. Please continue eating, but we're going to ask that you please hold down your conversations. We are just about to begin our luncheon keynote, and believe me, you do not want to miss a word. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to this conference. Welcome to this lunch keynote session. My name is Avis Jones-DeWeever, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here today. I hope that you will allow me a bit of moderator's deference. In the last session, we had one participant to hearken back to the time of Moses, so I hope you'll allow me to hearken back to the time of just this morning when we had our opening keynote. I just want to say that several years ago, Heidi Hartman and myself had the opportunity to contribute to a book that was entitled "There's No Such Thing as a Natural Disaster." And that particular book made the argument that in certain extraordinary circumstances, natural disasters are in fact especially impacted by, and in fact made much worse by man-made disasters. And we believed, and argued in that book, and still believe to this day, that perhaps there is no better example of that very unfortunate circumstance than what specifically happened to the people of New Orleans during Katrina. So that's my little statement on that. And so we will move forward beyond that right now. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Angela Glover Blackwell. She is the founder and Chief Executive Officer of PolicyLink. Her work is both visionary and groundbreaking on a wide range of issues that get to the heart of the needs of vulnerable populations all across this nation. You have her bio in your conference packet, so I'm not going to take the time to really go through her long list of illustrious achievements, but I will say that we are extremely fortunate to have her here. Her voice is one that we all need to hear to truly understand the fierce urgency of the work that we do and that we are all committed to. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Angela Glover Blackwell.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad that I came early. I came early because I wasn't sure that I could get here at all. I came from California, but I was already in town, and then with the snow, I was so concerned this morning about whether or not I would get here that I got up and made my way. But I was so glad that I was here to hear all of the morning's discussion because, frankly, the nuance of Social Security and some of these other issues, those are not things that I and my staff work on every day. And I have been concerned about doing this luncheon keynote because I thought that everybody there knows so much more than I know about the topic. How can I possibly add anything to their thinking? And so, being quite compulsive, I started reading and reading and reading, and then I said, well, you know, that just doesn't make sense. I can't become the expert in their field between now and when I give the speech. Obviously, they knew who I was when they asked me, and it's what I talk about every day that's probably of most interest. So I had already convinced myself of that before I came, but sitting here this morning and listening to the conversation, I began to see how the topics that we focus on at PolicyLink have so much bearing on the things that you think about on a day-to-day basis. Let me tell you a little bit about PolicyLink. We're a national research and action institute advancing economic and social equity by lifting up what works. When I use the term equity, I mean nothing more than just and fair inclusion into a society in which everybody can participate and everybody can prosper. And the lifting up what works grows out of our belief that you can take any problem that we face, and you can find people in communities who are coming up with innovative, effective solutions to those problems. That we live in a nation full of innovators, full of problem solvers, and I actually say that local leaders are national leaders because they're solving the nation's problems. But we have to keep coming up with the same solutions again and again. We have to keep reinventing things that we have already invented before because we don't have a way to systematically identify the things that have the potential to be successful, disaggregate them to understand what their component parts are, understand the implications for policy, and put policies in place that allow the best that we know to flourish. And so we're in the business of lifting up what works so that we're doing policy from the ground up and trying to learn from those who are working for change. I am going to talk to you today about the racial wealth divide, and I'm going to talk about race. I'm going to talk about Black and Latino populations. Now, I want to start off by putting those issues in a slightly different context. I have, with Manuel Pastor and Stuart Quo, done 2 books, one called Searching for the Uncommon Common Ground, the other one called The Uncommon Common Ground. Over the course of about 6 years, we found it, and the search was off. But we, that are all about race and America's future, and I did a book with Tavis Smiley, Covenant with Black America, and have really devoted myself to trying to deal with racial justice issues my entire career. I often say to people, I've had many jobs, but only one project, to try to do something about inequality and racial injustice in this country. So I talk about race a lot, and I often find that when I talk to audiences that are not Black or Latino, that the interest is not as sharp as I think it ought to be. Very often people listen politely. Often people get information they didn't have before. Those who are already committed to racial justice get recommitted, and those who haven't thought about it very much maybe have a new piece of information but go on doing their work in the same old way. I actually think that's not going to work going forward, because if we think about what the challenges are in this nation in the 21st century and moving forward, you can list them really on one hand. We have got to deal with climate change. We know that we do. We have got to deal with the issue of the disintegrating middle class, that if you think about what's made this country great, it has been a large and stable middle class, and if you think about what's under attack and dwindling, it is that middle class. We know that if we're going to remain strong into the future, we have to really help define and come into and be prepared to participate in the 21st century global economy. Those are things we know we have to do. The other thing that's going to define our future is the changing demographics. And let me tell you a little bit about those changing demographics. Already, the majority of babies born in this country are children or babies of color. Already, 40% of those under 18 in this country are young people and children of color. By 2023, children of color will be about half of the children in this country, and by 2025, they will be the majority. We know that somewhere between 2042 and 2050, the majority of people in this country will be people of color. This is something that I know you have heard before. You might not have thought about the 40% now, but you know that this is coming. I think that this coming change actually intersects directly with those 3 challenges I talked about: the middle class, the 21st century economy, and climate change. We know that if we don't figure out a way to get out of our cars and get into public transportation, if we don't find a way to return to our built environments and stop running away to distant areas and throwing away whole communities, that living together will determine whether or not we learn to live in a way that the economy, that the climate is what it needs to be, that the environment is saved. We know that if we're talking about a middle class, the middle class, if it's going to be vast, is going to have to be the people who are children now. And so when you think about who's going to be in the middle class, we know we can look out and we can see our future. And it's a 5-year-old Latina girl, and it's a 7-year-old Black boy. And if they're not ready to be in the middle class, there'll be no middle class. And we know that if we're talking about being productive into the 21st century, we have to invest in a workforce that can be productive, that can be middle class. We have to focus on education. We have to focus on job preparedness. We have to focus on the kind of issues that you're talking about in terms of security, to be able to create an atmosphere in which the people who will make up the future of the country will make it a country that we can be proud of. And so when you think about equity, just and fair inclusion, often that gets heard as a cry from Latinos and African Americans and Asians and Native Americans. But equity has taken on a different urgency. I actually contend that when we look forward equity has become the superior growth model for the nation. Because only by investing in those who are at risk of being left behind, it includes people who are white and poor, people who are white and living in rural communities, and it includes all of the people I just described, that the equity agenda is the agenda that's going to take us safely and productively into the future. And so, when I say that I'm going to be talking to you a little bit now about race, I didn't want you to think that we now have moved into a discussion about a special interest group. I'm talking about America's future. And I was so pleased to hear our president the other night in the State of the Union put his remarks in the context of the future, because this is the time that we have to be concerned about the future. And as I think about your conversation and the conversation that I am going to be carrying forward in many of my talks, from listening, from one, getting ready for this talk, and then listening to the things that I heard this morning, I don't think that any of us can afford not to be concerned about social insurance, not to understand what's happening with Social Security, not to have a deep knowledge of the debate and what's going on, because it has profound impact on all the issues that we've been concerned about. We have an extraordinary wealth gap in this country. The average family of color has 16 cents for every dollar owned by the average white family in the United States. The average wealth of married white households is $167,000. The average wealth of a single black household is $100. The average wealth of a single Latina household is $120. Black families save at the same rate as white families, but they have so much less money. Less money for tuition, less money to invest, less money for the hard times that we know are going to come. The wealth gap didn't just come about. It's been there from the very beginning. The disadvantage, because so many people have been disadvantaged who have been black and Latino in this country, not being able to take advantage of homes as a way to build wealth. Rules and policies that made discrimination in lending and discrimination in terms of where people could get homes have kept people out of those markets that would be lucrative. The wealth gap between white and African Americans more than quadrupled in the course of a generation. The same study that found that at least 25% of African American families have no assets whatsoever, no assets. Part of building equity means building wealth. And we need to have a way to be able to stand on a firm foundation as we think about moving forward. In doing my reading and thinking, I realized that in this environment, you often think about a three-legged stool when you're thinking about retirement, looking at savings and pensions and Social Security. But I actually think that there's another three-legged stool which we have to think about when we are thinking about financial stability, how families will get financial stability. It'll be based on the social insurance, Social Security, but also health and Medicare, and looking at unemployment and all of those things that bring about security, but also education and home ownership have been absolutely key. The three-legged stool of social insurance and education and home ownership have been absolutely key as African Americans have sought to move into the middle class. As Latinos have started to move into a middle class, what they have been dependent on is getting whatever homes they could and being able to use those homes to be able to send a child to college, never having as much equity in their homes in order to do that. And then we've been hit with the incredible crisis in terms of foreclosures. The foreclosure crisis has been bad for America. All of us probably know somebody who has been in trouble with their home. But it has been the biggest loss of black wealth in the history of the nation. The biggest loss of black wealth in the history of the nation. $194 billion drained out of African American communities already. $177 billion drained out of Latino communities. They were hit first, they were hit worse, they were the canary in the mine. If we had been paying attention to it, we wouldn't have ended up where we are. We wouldn't have ended up where we are. These communities have been hit so hard, and it is heartbreaking. Because what we have is a situation in which black and Latino families have been trying to do the right thing. Because of our pattern, our housing pattern, our patterns of settlement, this constant moving away from cities, leaving Latino and African American families behind in cities, with schools that weren't working, with services that were not there, with jobs that were not close by, we found people doing what was the right thing to do for their families, moving to suburban communities, taking on big loans in order to do the right things for their families, people trying to do the right thing. As our friends at the Kirwan Institute have pointed out, too often those Latino and Black families found themselves moving away from opportunity, not toward it. They were moving into situations where schools were starting to crumble. All of those issues that they were trying to get away from were just emerging there. And so what we have seen is this foreclosure crisis has dashed the dreams and the aspirations of a generation of families that were just trying to do the right thing. So we've got to think about what are we going to do? That as we look going forward and we think about what has been the engine for wealth building in America, if it's not going to be here for a generation, how do we find new ways to build wealth? How do we find new forms of home ownership? How do we develop new ways of asset building? And how do we think about all of our systems that are operating in financially with low-income families, how they put those aspirations front and center? Let me say something about that other stool, education. The other leg of the stool, education, so important in families all across the country, but particularly in families of color. Education is viewed as the one thing that if you get it, nobody can take it away from you, and it is the gift that keeps on giving. You get your child into higher education, get them a college degree, not only will that child have a better life, but the parent of the child can relax because they know the child's going to be making more money than they did and going to be able to contribute to them as they're growing older and not be a burden as they go older because they'll be able to stand on their own. Well, education is disappearing right from under us, that education is getting to be so expensive. So many students, if they're able to go to college at all, particularly if they come out of families that didn't have any equity that they could pull out of a home, have had to take on huge student loans. So that even if they're lucky enough to get in, if they have the tenacity to be able to stay in and they graduate, they can't help anybody. They can barely help themselves because of this burden of student loans. Many young people have turned to community colleges, even those who could get into four-year institutions, as a way to be able to begin to get a college education, something that they can afford. Now that we have seen so many young people across the country recognize that if you can't afford to go to a four-year college, you can go to a community college. The competition to get into community colleges has become very fierce, and many Black and Latino students find themselves being pushed out, as many white students are seeing the two-year community college as a way to be able to get into the state college, and the tuitions are going up. So when you think about where we are as a nation, that these issues of Social Security and how important Social Security has been, how much more important it is in Black and Latino families even than other families because of their low wages, that they are more dependent on it. That when you think about unemployment and how dependent so many families are going to be on it for a while, when you think about how important it is that we maintain the health of the nation going forward, all of these programs put together have to think in relationship to these broader issues of demographic change and what is it that those people who are going to be the future are going to need as we move forward as a nation. Thinking about equity and achieving equity are big challenges. One of the things that I think that is essential to do is to lead with it. Lead with equity. Because if we ask ourselves about what's the impact on full inclusion at the beginning of deliberations around any policy debate, any political debate, we will come out with different answers. One of the things that I'm very involved in is the whole issue of childhood obesity. We came to childhood obesity before it got to be the big issue that it is now because we recognize that when you're concerned about full inclusion, where you live in America is a proxy for opportunity. Where you live literally determines whether or not you're going to get to go to a good school, whether you live in an area where if you happen to own a home it has any equity, whether you live near public transportation that can link you to regional job opportunities, whether you live someplace where there are job opportunities, where you live as a proxy for opportunity. Where you live even determines how long you live and how well you live. There was a study done in the California Bay Area where I live that pointed out that if you lived in the Berkeley Hills, you would likely live 10 to 15 years longer than someone living in the Oakland Flatlands, the low-income area, mostly Black and Latino. Also, on the obesity issue, where you live determines whether or not you have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Think how sad it is that when you go to the doctor and the doctor says what you need to do is eat a healthier diet, but when you go back to your community, there is no place to buy a tomato, no place to buy fresh fruits and vegetables, and that's true all across this nation. 23 million Americans do not live near a full-service grocery store. Only 8% of African Americans live in a census tract with a grocery store. It even determines whether or not you have access to healthy food. We know that to deal with the obesity issue, children need to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. They're not in their neighborhoods. The other thing they need to do is exercise. Trust for Public Land has pointed out the majority of parks, if they exist at all, that are dilapidated and unsupervised are in poor Black and Latino communities. And we know, because there's so much concern about safety in these same communities, that the streets are not safe places to go out and play. And so we've been focused on childhood obesity. Well, there's a lot of focus on childhood obesity, but some of the policies that come up in terms of how to deal with them will miss the problem in low-income communities entirely if you don't think about the equity issue. Think about this whole issue of making sure that children walk to school. So we can have a policy trying to encourage children to walk to school, but what responsible parent in a community where the streets are not safe will let a kid just go out and walk to school or come home and play on the streets afterwards? You got to take these things into consideration. The same thing is true in the work that we are doing. If we understand that we have to make sure that these programs work for the people who are the future. You involve different people in your deliberations. You ask different questions. You have a different set of circumstances and measures that you will use to monitor how well you are making progress. And you understand that none of us can afford to work in our silos anymore. If you care about the well-being of people as they retire and move forward, you've got to be in the education arena. You have to join with people who are education advocates because that's part of the answer. If you care about how people are going to do into the future, you have to be in the how do we build wealth arena because that's part of the answer. Just as I need to go back and tell all of my colleagues that we cannot sit on the sidelines and see how the Social Security issue gets decided, we have to be on the front lines. We have to be as educated as anybody about this because how it gets decided will impact the future of the people who we consider to be our constituency as well as the future of the nation. All of us have to be in all of each other's business for us to be able to build a society that we can be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you. I told you you were in for a treat. We have 2 microphones set up, and if you have questions, please make your way to the microphone. If you can't, raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you. I think we have our first question right now. Yes.
My name is Leonie La Vega, and I lead the Direct Care Alliance. We're the national advocate for direct care workers. And I'm so pleased to hear you. It was such a pleasure for me to hear you after this morning and all the discussion about the middle class, because I speak for, mainly Latino and Black women that care for older Americans. And one of the questions that I have is, I think the goal of being more equitable and having that as a governing principle as we think of solutions, it's a really good idea. But in the world that I live, I ask my question, how can we actually achieve a more balance on the equation between the labor and the benefits that we provide and then the equity that we get in terms of benefits and education? Let me give you an example. Direct care workers care for older Americans in their homes, nursing homes, and other facilities. 3 million of them are doing that job right now. They're mostly Latino, immigrant women, Black Americans, Black women. Yet, they're not guaranteed a minimum wage. Many of them do not have access to health insurance and other essential benefits. But the value that they bring to older Americans is really hard to measure because of its value. They guarantee that a person is able to go to work when they have a disability or other disabling conditions because of age. They can guarantee that the people can basically work longer, so delay the retirement age by making sure that they can lead independent lives, that they be close to their community. They're helpful in preventing and securing the health of older Americans. And it seems like this is a workforce of the future. 5,000 older Americans are becoming age 65 or older. So we're at that very center of a lot of the factors that you were discussing come into play. And yet it's really hard to get people to pay attention when we're talking about some basic opportunities for this workforce that is so essential towards our future. So I just want to hear some ideas about how we could work towards that kind of equity, but just trying to be more fair and balance the scales a little bit. And the other reason that I think this question is really important, I'm really glad that you're here, is that it's really hard for advocates like me to make progress, because I feel like we're in a period of fear that the country is having a natural response with so many economic concerns in terms of retreating and saying, well, this is a good idea. We'd like to give minimum wage protections to home care workers. They did a great thing for my mom and my grandma, but this is not the time because we have so many other problems. So I look forward to hearing your response, and thank you so much.
That's really a hard question. It's a timely question, and I think it's one that with the right allies and the right debate, we might be able to make some progress, because there are many things about right now that make this timely. I'm one of those at the front end of the aging baby boomers, and so I've just gone through having to have support from my parents so they could stay at home. And it was so clear to me, because I work and my husband works and my brothers work and my children work, that there was no way that we could handle this if we didn't reach outside of family, which is the natural thing that you think would do as your parents begin to age. And we're about to see a whole generation that's going to be facing this for the next 25 years in a huge way, as the baby boomers have to deal with the fact that they have to have support for their families. And it's hard to find the people who you want to have watch your parents, because it's even more difficult than finding people to watch your children, because your parents are opinionated and will tell you what they think about it. And so I think that there is the possibility to open this discussion up in a way that it wasn't as possible at another time. The other thing I think that we have to really do is figure out how to take the opening conversation that I started with and figure out how to make that a national conversation. The equity agenda is America's agenda. To the degree that we invest in people who are going to be the future, we invest in ourselves. We secure a brighter future. If that could catch on, we would find that there would be real concern for people who are in the jobs and people who are emerging, people who are trying to figure out how to make their way into the middle class. And the conversation that we're having about Social Security fits right into this as well. We have to move away from something that we've been doing for the past years, recent years, is that we have been so cutting and dicing and separating ourselves. We've been getting more and more focused on our interests, and our interests have become more and more narrow. Also, it's almost you and the person who's standing next to you rather than being vast. We have to, as a nation, really come to grips with what the future is and how we have to invest. So my response to you is that I think we need to look at the communications arena so that we can begin to talk about the issue that you've raised in a way that draws a lot of people into it and they begin to see their interests. We have to look at it as an organizing effort so that we begin to find many other groups, and we have to find some uncommon allies to begin to join and walk step in step, shoulder to shoulder with you as we try to improve the quality of the jobs that are the jobs not only that so many people hold, but that so many people need, for the people who are there to be qualified, to be dependable, to be good people who we know we can count on. And if we need all of that, we need to pay people well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Daniel Marin, Social Security Works. what does work for education? And something that comes to mind, because you were talking about what policies work, a lot of the model that's been touted a lot lately is Jeffrey Canada's project, the Harlem Children's Zone in New York City, kind of this sort of cradle to adulthood system of, healthcare, working on improving the schools, working on improving parenting, and yet it's also come under criticism for harming workers' rights, for attacking unions and things like that. So I guess, just put that out there. What you think of that model in particular, and of, in general, what does work in terms of education?
I don't think the problem with education is that we don't know what works. I think we actually have near consensus in this nation about what would really allow all children to be able to reach their full potential. It includes really good teachers. Everybody agrees that you have to have a good teacher. We have to have enough time in school for children to be able to learn. We need to have a rigorous curriculum. And the other thing we need to do, which is where Jeff Canada comes in, is that we need to invest in what we've learned from one of the most massive natural experiments that we've seen, and that is that we don't rely just on schools to educate our children. All of you who have children, or if you have sisters and brothers who have children, you know that there are other things. You try to find a good school. Within that school, you try to find a good teacher. But you make sure that you allow your children to develop their interests, whether it's in music or theater or sports or whatever it might be. So you have these extracurricular things you do. You know that you don't let a child sit idle for a whole summer. You make sure they're doing something stimulating, so when school starts up again in September, that they're ready and they can keep going. You know that you pay attention to their health. You don't send them to school sick. You make sure that they're get all of their immunizations and that they're healthy children. You make sure that they get good meals and good food and that they get exercise. What the Harlem Children's Zone has been able to do is to take that natural experiment that's been conducted by families with resources and education and make sure that we can apply it to all children. So that the Harlem Children's Zone took an area and made sure that every child in that community would not just go to a good school, but would be healthy, would be ready for school, and would have the kind of extracurricular activities and the kind of time and learning that it takes. And so the whole thing is what we need to do. It's so funny you asked that question because PolicyLink runs the Promised Neighborhoods Institute. And what the Promised Neighborhoods Institute is a resource for promised neighborhoods around the country, and promised neighborhoods were set up by the Obama administration as a way to build out on what Jeff Canada did in Harlem. So it allows for communities to apply for federal dollars to be able to match local dollars inspired by the Harlem Children's Zone to provide those wraparound and supportive that are those things that are needed. So the answer to the question is we know a lot about what works. We know that we need to expand what we know about what works in the school, into the community, and we all need to be supporters and proponents for doing what we know makes a difference, including providing children with the support outside of school that they need if their parents aren't able to provide it. Thank you.
Thank you. While we're waiting for the next question, I'm going to ask a question myself. How do we overcome the challenge of selling an equity agenda to a broad populace when we have a culture that is based on the mythology of bootstraps ascendants, based on the mythology of equal opportunity for all already exists, so why would we need an equity agenda? And one sharp example recently in the news, particularly as it relates to this issue of education, was the mother in Ohio who was sentenced to 10 days and fined over $30,000 for sending her child to a better school that was outside of her school district. How do we make the argument to the broader populace that given the very overt inequities, that outcomes are largely bred in individuals by their geographic circumstance, as you argue, rather than a broader, overarching framework that delivers to everyone the same opportunities no matter where they live?
It's the $64 million question. Because, and it's going to be hard, let's just face it. I don't know how this audience reacted when I said, if you're concerned about the future, equity is the superior growth model. I have no idea how you reacted. I'm sure you all listened to it. You thought, well, that's a different grouping of words. You know, what's she mean? If nothing else, you ask, what does she mean? And then you thought about it. And you thought about it, and some of you have said, well, yeah. And some of you have said, eh. And you're a very interested audience. And so when you get outside of an interested audience and you start trying to talk to the American people, I have no doubts that this is tough. I don't think it is impossible, though, because I have lived long enough to see the nation do the impossible. That I lived through the civil rights movement. I mean, I was a child in 1954. And in 1954, I actually have a very interesting story about that. And Margaret Sims is in the audience. Margaret and I grew up together, and so I shouldn't be telling Margaret's age. I'm free to tell my own. But Margaret and I grew up in the same community in St. Louis, Missouri. But in St. Louis, Missouri, in 1954, I was going to segregated schools. There was a school on the corner, and I went to a school 6 blocks away because the school on the corner was all white. We had moved into this neighborhood as the second black family to move onto our block, the first having moved in the day before. And I often say to people, I know I lived in a powerful black family because our presence caused everybody on that block to move off. Now, how many people can do that? We cleared that block out. And so by the time we got to 1954, most of the white families had moved away, but there was a white family across the street that had not, and they had a daughter, and the daughter was exactly my same age, and we both loved dolls, and we were fast friends, in and out of each other's homes. She went to the school on the corner, I went to the school 6 blocks away. 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education was decided, little girls, I mean, we were almost too little to know what was happening, but we knew. I remember us grabbing hands and doing that little jig in the street because we were going to be going to the same school in the fall. Well, when the fall came, I did go to the school on the corner, but the little girl across the street was bused to a school in the suburbs. And that little story begins a story of America that says what happened when we had a moment to do something extraordinary and we failed to pick it up. We did the suburbs, we built the suburbs, we abandoned the cities, we abandoned our future, and now we're reaping the results of those decisions. But the thing that we did see coming out of the civil rights movement is extraordinary breakdown of barriers that I'm sure for generations before me, people were sure those barriers would always be there. There was never any expectation that things would change, and things did change. And we all witnessed the president, the election of the president of the United States as a black man, and my parents were able to see that in their lifetime. Absolutely amazing. I believe that this country can do extraordinary things, but it requires extraordinary conversation. We had extraordinary conversation during the civil rights movement. I can remember again as a girl, I grew up in the Presbyterian church, and we absolutely, white Presbyterian churches and black Presbyterian churches, they used to get together and have extraordinary conversations. Our 3 channels caused us to have an extraordinary national conversation about race during the civil rights movement and the bus boycotts and the sit-ins and all of that. Everybody in America had to talk about it. We have got to figure out in this very different time how to have a conversation not about race, but about America's future. America's future depends on what we do about race. And if we say it enough, if we say it in ways that are not threatening, if we say it in ways that allow people to see their way into the conversation, I think we can begin to have a conversation about equity. But as we're waiting for the conversation to happen, we need more organizations like yours, more like mine, more like other groups, more like the Kirwan Institute, that are, while we're waiting for America to catch up, we're putting policies in place. We're putting representatives in place. We're getting people involved in their metropolitan planning organizations, so we're making different transportation decisions. So you've got to have advocates pushing it before the American people are ready for it, and you have to have others pushing a conversation that helps the American people understand this is not something you do for the other, this is something you do for yourself. Thank you.
And we have a question.
Good afternoon. My name is James Collins. I'm with New York Statewide Senior Action Council. And I sort of really want to address Anne's question about how we might address these problems to the wider public. And what I would suggest is reframing the equity agenda as a human rights agenda. I think this is much broader in scope. 62 years ago, and again, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a guiding force behind the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where every human being is born equal in dignity and rights. And if you don't receive access to adequate health care or to education or to job, whether because of race or because of gender or because of age, it's a violation of your right as a human being. And I think we need to frame it in those terms to people. And I think this, again, we're talking about a globalization. Everybody around the world understands a human rights agenda. I think it's broader than equity. It's basically a human rights issue. Thank you.
Do you have any comments?
I don't disagree. I don't think that we have the language, though. I am open to other language. I talk about it now as an equity agenda because that language works for some of the challenges we're facing right now. But I don't think that that's the language that's going to capture the imagination of the American people. I think that we have to separate what we're working for from what we call it. When I defined equity as just and fair inclusion, I mean just that, just and fair inclusion. The goals of equity are to create those conditions that allow everybody to reach their full potential. Once you know that's what you're working for, then you can find different language in different settings, because some people will be attracted to human rights, some people will be attracted to civil rights, some people will be attracted to equal opportunity, others just the simple word opportunity, others competitiveness. I think there are all kinds of words that we can use. The point is to dedicate yourself to this notion of full inclusion, fairness, etc. Sometimes when the debate comes about whether to use the equity language, though, the debate is really not about language, but it's about the agenda. And so you have to separate what's the agenda that we're working for from what's the goal that we're working for. But I think that some of our dedicated communications people could help us a lot to find language that allows people to hear themselves. Thank you.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions, maybe just one. Any other questions? Do you have any other comments that you want to relay to us?
Is that a
before you
question
leave?
there?
Oh, I didn't see you.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm a visiting scholar here at NASI. And I'm wondering, because I agree with opportunity and equality, but looking specific at issues, the Latino community contributes more than $10 billion every year to Social Security, and they never see a penny of those benefits. So how do we address that to bridge the racial wealth divide? And then also specific bills like the DREAM Act, where you have Latino children who are in the country since like 4 years old and grew up here, and they're denied the opportunity to go to college. How do we address that?
Do you have ideas about how to address the first? Certainly, I was happy to see the President walk right up to the DREAM Act. He didn't say the words, but he certainly was describing it in his State of the Union address. It's going to be very important. Let me just say that I thought that it was very strategic to frame the DREAM Act and to lead in with it the way that we saw it almost happen, because such a fairness argument, such a contribution argument in those two. But what about the Social Security part of your question? Do you have suggestions in that part of it?
Well, if we have comprehensive immigration reform, we could bring them into the system. Would be
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. Absolutely. Other things? It seems to me we have to, the first question that was asked about the home health workers, I mean, we have to also be clear about what those professions are that people are working in, make sure that we're upgrading them as well, right? Yeah, great. Thank you.
Definitely in your overall argument about just the conversation.
Right.
Because there are probably very few issues that it seems like we are more paralyzed with regards to having a civil conversation about in this country than is the issue of immigration. And when you point to this issue of billions of dollars contributed to Social Security and other ways in which the immigrant populations contribute to this country, but don't really oftentimes receive reciprocation in that, and beyond that, oftentimes receive vilification. I think that that is a great example of why we need greater conversations.
Because people don't even know. That's the other part of it. I'm often struck by the fact that what people don't know. I haven't even talked in my comments about something I usually talk about, and that is the extreme incarceration rates that we have for particularly black men, but growing among Latino men and growing fast among young women of both races. And people have no idea about the facts of incarceration, how few of them are actually in there for violent crimes, how much of this is for nonviolent, how much of it has to do with drugs. We have just become a society of throwaway people and throwaway communities, and we have to just move out of that mindset and start utilizing every place and everybody. Thank you for your question. Right.
And if that is the last question, thank you for your attention.